4,000 Hezbollah fighters have been injured or killed by these exploding pagers. That, as the story goes so far, Hezbollah has denied their fighters cell phones in the field because the IDF has been tracking their GPS, so they were giving them pagers. So it appears, again, from what I've read, that the IDF was able to fix these pagers in Iran before they got shipped to the fighters in Hezbollah. So they were fixed with explosives to go off at a signal. That signal went off a few hours ago, essentially. And 4,000. So it was the most destructive single day in Hezbollah's activities with Israel, including the Iranian ambassador who had his own personal Hezbollah pager. And I tell you what, Heather keeps telling me, Phil, it's not funny, because I keep laughing at this. I mean, it's a little bit off-putting that this kind of technology exists, but I don't own a pager. So I'm not buying an Iranian-made pager. There's probably a good market for secondhand pagers right now. Anyway, but anyway, that's in our good news segment, as far as I'm concerned. The distraught and frustrated Calvin, our first story here, and again, this one's just kind of for fun. The Pope was recently on another sort of international swing. He was in Singapore, and he was speaking with youth, and he made headlines again because in his final address to them, he told them that all languages for God and all religions make their way to the same God. So this is from the Catholic Herald. This is from the Vatican's translation of his speech, of his talk. So, this isn't a frustrated Protestant or Calvinist who hates the papists who's translating this. This comes from the Vatican. The translation does. In Singapore, Pope Francis on Friday wrapped up a 3-day visit to Singapore by declaring that all religions are a path to God. They are like different languages in order to arrive at God, but God is God for all, the Pope said, who had set aside his prepared text and spoke largely off the cuff, from the heart, you might say. Since God is God for all, then we are all children of God. If you start to fight, my religion is more important than yours, mine is true and yours isn't, where will that lead us? He asked out loud. You got to love these emotionally loaded questions, right? There's only one God, and each of us has a language to arrive at God. Some are Sikh, Muslim, Hindu, Christian. They are all different paths to God. All right, so there have been a handful of things that Pope Francis have done that we go, okay, that's super marginal. That's really sketchy. This is the kind of thing that would get your average priest defrocked, kicked out of the church and sent back to seminary, or just simply excommunicated from the church, period, because this is contrary to church teaching. So this now is what Pope Francis is saying off the cuff, from the heart. I've mentioned this before. I do not believe Pope Francis is interested in being the Pope of the Catholic Church. I believe he's interested in being the leader of an international ecumenical religion. That's what I think Pope Francis is after. Now, you can dig into his background as a Jesuit. The people who trained him in South America were liberation theologians, which meant they come from a field of Christian theology that combines Marxism with social justice inside of the church. So he comes from some really, really curious roots. And sure enough, when he strays from his prepared comments, these are the kinds of things that the Pope likes to say. So keep your eyes open for the things Pope Francis has to tell us about. This doesn't mean he can't, unless they, yeah. So the people who get in trouble in the Catholic Church right now are the people who kind of stick their neck out for Catholic teaching, right? That's happened more than a handful of times now. But Pope Francis, in his inner circle of theological advisors, are a really curious crowd of people, a super curious crowd of people. All right. As I was collecting what I wanted to collect for tonight, I ran across this quote Garry Kasparov, the chess grandmaster out of the Soviet Union, he had written this. The point of modern propaganda isn't only to misinform or push an agenda, it is to exhaust your critical thinking, to annihilate truth. So we've talked about propaganda in very similar kinds of terms, to recognize propaganda as the manipulation of vocabulary and reality and perception to put across a very particular kind of political view or something a group of people want you to believe instead of that. We think of propaganda in those terms to get us to believe something shallow or that we otherwise would not normally believe. When you read people who survived the Soviet Union, who survived communism in China and other places around the world, they add to that, okay, yes, propaganda does that, but the other thing it does is it whittles down your will to resist. You are covered, you are peppered with lies and propaganda for so long, and so often it wears you down. It becomes exhausting. So it exhausts your critical thinking. It really does get tiresome trying to deal with these things if you do try to engage and deal with these things. And to annihilate the notion of truth itself. It's very easy to give up and just say, well, I'm just going to leave all that to that. And people have given up on the notion of truth altogether because of propaganda and the way that it works. And everybody has a million different things to say. So the things I was gathering for this evening all kind of fit inside of this category. The first one we touched on a little bit last week. Meg, sorry, but there have been a couple of developments. So this has to do with the immigrants are eating pets in small towns in Ohio story. All right, and here's how this development went. And here's how these kinds of pieces of propaganda are designed to just simply wear you down to the point where you don't engage, you stop dealing with it, you stop resisting it. All right, so there's a timeline to this, right? So the first thing that starts happening is you have these videos from city councils where citizens in Springfield, Ohio, and as it turns out, some of the other cities around Springfield, Ohio, are saying, hey, look, these things are happening in my front yard, at my kids' schools. My pet has disappeared. They're being barbecued in other people's backyards. And so citizens are making these kinds of reports. So it hits the surface, and obviously that's sensational. 20,000 Haitian immigrants somehow find their way into a town in Ohio that's normally 60,000 people large. How does that happen? We'll talk about that next week. We'll explain to you exactly how that happens. Do you know that the United States, the current administration, has imported 5% of Haiti into the United States? They didn't come here, they were flown here. 5% of an entire nation. So a bunch of them get dumped in the middle of Ohio. So all this stuff hits the surface. So then Trump mentions it inside of the debate last Tuesday night, right? We were here doing important stuff while everyone else was out there watching this debate, right? So he mentions it in the debate, and it becomes a meme, and people are putting it to song, and it's going viral. It's going crazy, right? So then, of course, the reaction to that, those who politically disagree with him, he's lying, and there's no evidence that this happened. So a handful of news organizations call a couple of police chiefs, call a couple of city council members, say, well, there's no evidence, we don't know this. So you've got this competing narrative. You have these citizen reports, and Trump and Vance are saying, yes, it's true, this is what's happening. Then you've got mainstream media and a bunch of others going, no, this is all a lie. You've got to be careful because none of this is really true. Well, while that is all unfolding, it turns out that there were 33 called-in bomb threats to the public school system in Springfield, Ohio. Because part of the story was that these Haitian immigrants and their families with their kids are now in public schools. It's overwhelmed the public school system, and things are becoming very difficult for teachers and for the rest of the students. So the public school thing is part of that story. So 33 bomb threats are called in. It's true, it's not true. So while all of that is unfolding, this investigative reporter, we've talked about him a couple of times, his name is Christopher Rufo. He literally put this out on Twitter. He said, okay, me and my organization, we are going to find out if this is true. So he puts out on Twitter, if you can give me verifiable evidence of this happening in Springfield or the areas around it, I will pay you $5,000. So he actually puts a bounty out there and he says, okay, we're going to verify, we're going to make sure it's true, but if it's true, we're going to pay you $5,000 for it. The very next day, Russell Moore publishes a long think piece in the Atlantic magazine. Now, remember who Russell Moore is. He is the editor-in-chief of Christianity Today. Now, if you were to read his stuff or listen to his podcast, you would not know where he stands religiously, because his shtick is the evangelical church and Christians who are theologically and politically conservative are the single greatest problem that we have in our culture today. That's his shtick. So he publishes this article in the Atlantic. Trump's lie is another test for Christians. Here's a chance for us to stop the violent rhetoric and to show mercy and to do the kinds of things that Christ told us to do. Inside of, okay, this is a timeline because this is important. Inside of that article, two of the claims that he makes. First of all, the stories are false. You know, the mainstream media tells us they're false, so we know they're false. The other claim he makes is that these 33 bomb threats were called in by Trump supporters and evangelical Christians. So he makes those two claims inside of this article in the Atlantic. On the same day, Christopher Rufo and his organization begin publishing their verified accounts of ducks and geese in city parks and people's pets being stolen, barbecued, and eaten. On the same day, he and his organization verify that several of these stories really are true. So Russell Moore takes the lie line. Turns out Russell Moore is wrong. Has Russell Moore apologized for this? No, he has not. The very next day, the governor of Ohio, DeWine, in a press conference, says, we have discovered that all 33 bomb threats came from foreign actors. They were called in from out of the country. It's election interference is what it is. So not a single one of those bomb threats came from inside the house, from Trump supporters or from evangelical Christians. Has Russell Moore retracted a single thing that he wrote in that article? No, he has not. This is how propaganda works. He wants to leave that out there. He's going to write another one of these articles next week when the next thing shows up to make sure that you know that you are the problem. And he is fine, and people like him are perfectly fine lying, sticking with a lie, and acting as if it is true, right? It is exhausting, and it wears you down. How many times do you want to deal with this? How many times do you want to deal with the same thing over and over and over again? And most people just go, I'm tired. I'm done, right? Forget it. Russell Moore's not done. His other friends are not done doing the same thing as well. So more of the same kind of thing, lies that have been told, debunked, but have been clung to. So also in that debate last Tuesday night, Kamala Harris makes the comment at one point in the debate, there are no states in the nation where you can abort your baby all the way to the end of 9 months. And it's absolutely ridiculous to believe that a child can be born and left to die outside of the womb, right? So that gets repeated over and over and over again. And it was, as I got done last Tuesday night and I started watching people's reaction to the debate, this is the thing that was immediately reacted to the most, and people started producing the data. We live in the state of Colorado, and we know that that's simply not true. One map here is from Axios.com, who is no friend to conservative evangelical Christians, no friend typically to common sense and truth either, but they have their own map, and they list 8 states with no term limit on abortions, and that includes the state of Colorado. And it wasn't that long ago when the VP candidate, Tim Walz, signed into law in the state of Minnesota a certain kind of Born Alive Act. But what it does is if the mother doesn't want the child and the child survives abortion, it allows that baby to die on the table next to the mother, right? So he himself signed one of those bills into existence. They lied during the debates, and they have stuck with it. They've stayed with it. They haven't changed course, right? Over and over and over and over and over and over and over. I mentioned Preston Sprinkle in a sermon a couple of Sundays ago. There's only one reason to listen to his podcast or read his best-selling books, and that is to learn what not to think about what Preston's. Yeah, how many of you remember the Colorado Springs Independent, the local kind of free liberal rag here in town? I used to go and get coffee downtown a lot. I would pick up a CS Independent every now and then, and I used to joke with people. It tells me what not to think. It tells me who not to vote for, right? That's the role that Preston Sprinkle should play. But he's a best-selling Christian author. He has this massively popular Christian podcast. But read this tweet of his and tell me, this hits you wrong, but your first reaction is I've got to stop and think as to why this hits me wrong. So he wrote this inside of all of this kerfuffle about the pets and immigration. The same people who say we should go to Haiti on a missions trip to serve the people there should never say we don't want Haitians living among us. It's a great tweet, but it's a terrible thought. It's a terrible thought. It makes all kinds of mistakes. And some of those mistakes are nefarious, and some of them are on purpose. So at the very least, and it's good for us to stop and think this stuff through, again, because a guy like Preston Sprinkle is very popular in Christian circles, and then also in sort of marginal Christian circles. This is philosophically what's called a false dichotomy. A false dichotomy is when someone tells you it's A or B. Right now, tell me, A or B. Is it A or B? And you stop and think for a second, you go, no, wait a second, C is also an option. They're going, nope, you've got two options. That's it, A or B. What are your options? And you know that it's false. You know there are other options involved. So it's a manipulative rhetorical move to force a false dichotomy down someone's throat. So it is a false dichotomy. These are not the only two options available to people. The conversation about immigration is far more complicated than if you're a Christian, you should allow anybody to live in your neighborhood ever, all the time, and you shouldn't ever say anything about it. By the way, President Sprinkle does not live in Springfield, Ohio. He does not live in a neighborhood where he's worried about someone who doesn't speak his language stealing his child's cat and eating it. He doesn't live in that neighborhood. So he has what's called a luxury belief. We've talked about that before. You should keep that one in your back pocket. Most people have luxury beliefs. These are beliefs that do them social good and no material harm, but do other people material harm. So he can feel good about his beliefs, but it does no harm to him when in fact his beliefs, when they get implemented, do other people actual harm. It's a luxury belief. And it is also emotional blackmail. You're supposed to read that tweet and go, you're right. I want to be a nice person, so I shouldn't do that. It's designed to make you, a decent person, feel guilted into accepting his uncritical position on immigration. So it's funny how these things work, because in one tweet, that's basically one complex sentence, it requires several minutes worth of unpacking to be clear about why we think this is ridiculous and manipulative. This is how emotional blackmail works. This is how false dichotomies work, and it is exhausting. Guys, it is exhausting to watch this stuff, to try to think through this stuff, to deal with this stuff, because it's the same thing over and over and over again. There's this really interesting story in Galatians chapter 2. Meg, I'm sorry, I lost it again. In Galatians chapter 2, verses 11 and 12, but when Cephas, or Peter, came to Antioch, I, Paul, opposed him face to face because he stood condemned. For before certain men came from James, he was eating with the Gentiles. But when they came, he drew back and separated himself, fearing the circumcision party. So he was behaving one way that was in accordance with the gospel, and all of the apostles knew it, and Peter knew it. He'd been told by God and shown by God in Acts chapter 10 in this very dramatic fashion to go ahead and eat with Gentiles. And yet, for fear of the circumcision party, he behaves in a fashion that is contrary to what he believes. So the Apostle Paul shows up and confronts him publicly because the Apostle Peter had been steered. He had been steered by a group of people that had some version of emotional influence over him. So he behaved in a way that he otherwise would not have behaved. So Paul said, you've been steered. This is emotional blackmail. You know you behaved in the wrong fashion. So some group of people, when we talk about emotional blackmail or being steered by someone, a book I read recently had this wonderful image that has kind of stuck with me. And the question was, how many steering wheels do you have on your back, and who has their hands on those steering wheels? So who says something that makes you go, oh, I need to change what I think. Oh, I need to alter this just a little, because somebody's behind you doing this with the steering wheel. And the point of his book was, you're a follower of Jesus Christ. You should take all those steering wheels off of your back, and you should pay attention to Jesus Christ. Some group of people have enough influence over you to get you to believe or behave in a way that otherwise you would not. Who does that to us? How and why? Is it because you want a byline in the New York Times or the Atlantic, or you want to be interviewed on MSNBC, which Russell Moore was the day after his article, and he stuck to his story? Is that who's steering, who's got the hands on the steering wheel that's attached to your back? Some thoughts about dealing with emotional sabotage or blackmail or being steered by people. Some of this comes from the way the Apostle Paul dealt with it in this passage and the surrounding verses. Respond, don't react. Think, don't emote. To react is to grow emotional immediately and to grow frustrated or shut off or turned off or angry. To respond is to think it through and to deal with it. Paul probably had the same pressure from other circumcision parties as well. But he's telling Peter, we do things differently now. We think, we don't emote in those moments. Take a stand. Maybe even take a stand publicly. I'm going to publicly say, no, this is wrong. This is incorrect. I'm not going to behave this way. I'm not going to believe this way. Yes, there's some kind of pressure coming upon me to do it, but I'm simply not going to do it. And, we resolve that, but then it might also be valuable to say it out loud. We become accountable to other people when we say these kinds of things out loud, and that's taking responsibility for yourself. So the Apostle Paul, when he publicly tells Peter, don't separate yourself from Gentiles, Paul is also laying responsibility on himself to act the same way. Does that make sense? So now he cannot be called to account if he feels pressure to separate himself from Gentiles. So we take responsibility for our own actions as well. I'm going to do what I can to not be steered, to be clear about what I believe and what is right and what is true, and to behave that way all the time. There's a lot of emotional blackmail going on out there. It's designed to exhaust us. It's designed to turn. And people who don't have the resource of their faith, they don't have the resource of Scripture, they don't have the resource of the family of God, it's going to be so easy for them to just simply disconnect or decide no one really knows what's right or true. It's going to be so easy. So the strength of the family of God and our relationship with the Word of God just grows more important all the time, the more complicated and blackmailing the world gets around us.